Thanks everybody for joining us. My name is Matthew Johnson Robertson. I'm an associate professor at the University of Michigan in robotics. And we're really excited to have this panel come together to talk about the future of robotics, which is sort of a scary and nebulous topic, but I'm excited to be joined by a bunch of people that hopefully can help us unpack it. So to get started, we'll just sort of do intros and I'll let, we have a pretty big panel, so I'll let people sort of introduce themselves with whatever level of detail they think the audience will be excited about. So we'll start with Tom, and he can tell us a little bit about himself and then go from there.
Sure, thanks, Matt. My name is Tom Williams. I'm an assistant professor of computer science at Colorado School of Mines, and I'm a human-robot interaction researcher. I study human-robot communication. Especially recently, I've been doing a lot of work on understanding the moral implications of different robot communication strategies, both from sort of computational, psychological, and more ethical, moral, philosophical positions.
Awesome. Let's keep it rolling. Edward, you want to tell us a little about yourself? Maybe not.
Wait, sorry, I didn't. Yeah, who were you asking?
Sorry, Edward.
Sorry, that's me. I'm having terrible connection today, so sorry for that.
No worries.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Edward, and I work at the eLaw Center for Law and Digital Technologies at Leiden University in the Netherlands, and I address the legal and regulatory implications of the use of robotics with a special focus on healthcare. And that's basically what I do. Nice to meet you.
Awesome. Lydia, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, happy to. I'm Lydia Tapia. I'm an associate professor at the University of New Mexico in computer science, and my research is in motion planning. We've got applications in robotics, obviously, and computational biology and gaming systems as well. So what I've been looking into this topic of this panel is I'm also the Robotics and Automation Society Women in Engineering Chair. So we've been doing a lot of studies about diversity participation in the Robotics and Automation Society conferences. So happy to talk with you guys about that today.
Awesome. We'll keep it rolling. How about Chris?
Hi, I'm Chris McNabb. I'm at the University of Calgary. I'm a professor doing research into putting personalities on robots.
Awesome. Awesome. We'll stay in the C's. Chad.
All right, awesome. So I'm Chad Jenkins, fellow of Michigan Robotics with Matt here. So I'm a newly promoted professor in computer science, but also associate director of the Robotics Institute. I work in how can we program robots from human demonstration, and so we've been working on ways not just to have robots learn from demonstration, but also have them see better, so we could just show them things that we want them to do, and they can understand it and reason about the details on their own. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. Okay, how about Kendall?
Hello, everybody. My name is Kendall Queen. I'm a fourth-year PhD student at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm currently advised by Kostas Danielidis. Supervision expert. I'm in vision and robotics, so I'm something of a hybrid in the lab, and I'm investigating autonomous vehicles and robotic applications for the BioInspire event camera. Mainly, my research just focuses on deriving control decisions from event data in situations where cameras fail, like low light and high speed. So yeah, glad to be here and glad to talk to you guys about future robotics.
Awesome. And last but not least, we'll have Naveen tell us a little about
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity. So I'm from the Toyota Research Institute, where I'm a senior research scientist. My research covers the areas of tactile perception and control, soft robotics, and what it means for us to achieve truly robust manipulation in homes. And Toyota's mission is, of course, putting robots in homes to help elderly people. And a little side note, one of my key interests in participation in events like this is that I'm also one of the organizing members of TRI's LGBTQ+ employee resource group. So try to coordinate activities related to diversity and inclusion for our LGBTQ+ members.
Awesome. Well, I'm really honored to be joined by all of you. Super excited to talk about this. It's a heady topic. So we'll start with a real easy question. What's the role of intellectual diversity in robotics? And so what I'm hoping is that if anybody has we can kind of riff off each other, but I'd love to dig into if we're trying to think about where robotics is going, what does it mean to think about the ways robotics is being practiced now? And then, what are the ideas or subgenres or whatever of where we see robotics going in the future? And what does it mean to have a diverse set of ideas in robotics? I know that's a really open-ended one, but anyone want to jump in and then we can kind of try to go from there?
I'm always happy to start off. Or Chris, please, if you want to go first.
Well, I guess I can start off with a bit of a complaining kind of attitude because this is a field that's in its infancy. I mean, we've only just begun this research into the idea of robotics, and yet we have kind of a bad attitude where, everything has almost been completed. It seems like, there will be many paradigm changes in this field in the future. There's going to be many wild new ideas that nobody can accept at first and have to wrap their heads around. I mean, we're going to see all kinds of amazing things in this field in the future. So, I mean, we have to keep our minds open to these possibilities rather than saying, nope, only the traditional things that we've seen for the past 30 years could possibly be true. I mean, that's my take on it anyway.
I want to give exhibit 1 for Chris's point, which is neural networks. I think if you went to a robotics conference or a machine learning conference and talked about neural networks as the savior of our field about 15 years ago, you would have been laughed out of the room. And it has changed. And I think we can see that in the program. And I think, if I had to be honest, I think neural networks are sort of a local minimum for us right now. I think there is even more, or local maximum, I guess, optimum. There's the next thing that's coming. I put my bet on probabilistic inference to come back. But I think, so we don't really know what it is. And so we have to be inclusive of ideas because we never know which one is going to be the one that transforms our field.
On a different level, there's also little bits and pieces where robotics is always drawing from other fields. For instance, solution to this particular equation comes from something somebody did in fluid mechanics somewhere out there on a problem on oil pipelines. So you have to keep your mind open to the idea that whatever you're solving, it's based on math, which is so common to so many other fields, and whatever you're solving is finally going to help people, and people are a fundamentally different kind of science. We are not dealing with just objects in an abstract universe, right? And so I think it's in its inherent nature that robotics has to keep its ears open and listen to what's going on everywhere else in every other field.
Yeah, I think that connecting to this, I think that one thing that it's really growing is the interdisciplinarity of the topic. I think that the more and more we're seeing a lot of attention to ethics, but also at the School of Law, we're really trying to figure out whether the existing regulations that we have frame the problems that arise in an appropriate manner, or whether we need to revise that. So I think that there will be like greater connection with other disciplines, and also including policymakers and society at large, not only as a sort of subject, but also as an object, so a little bit everything mixed, so that people also have an active say into the development on these.
I think that's absolutely correct. And I think that in robotics, as a new field that is sort of positioned within engineering, there is a tendency for people to focus just on the math and view it as, just a series of, math problems. And yes, we might be drawing on math from other fields, but in addition, it's so important to understand that it's pretty impossible to be doing robotics in a way that doesn't intersect with humans or society in any way. And thus we really need to be also thinking of robotics, as well as lots of other areas of engineering, but robotics in particular as more of a computational social science for many of the applications that we're working on.
And even talking about how robotics is still in its infancy, but yet spans across so many different sectors. We have it in surgery, we have it in space, we have it in health, we have it in transportation, and even some forms on our hips, right? So definitely having an idea of where robotics will intersect with humanity at a more personal level is important to think about.
Something that, sorry, go ahead.
No, you're good. You're good. You got it.
Something that sort of sparks a lead into the next question I wanted to jump in with this team is the idea of this discrepancy between academia and industry. And one of the things that I think can be useful for our field in thinking about where robotics is going or where it may be in a couple of years is to look at computer vision as an interesting bellwether for what transformations have happened, particularly around the industry academia split, that have been really, really quick, and I would argue quite drastic. And so I was flipping through some of the stats from the Computer Vision and Pattern Recognition Conference, CVPR, from this year. And one of the things that's most striking, and this is a trend that's been going on for a while, but I want to use it as a jumping off point to talk about where robotics might go, is that if you look at the top 20 contributors to CVPR, it has been changing over the last 10 years, but it has really landed in a place where 5 of the top 10 contributors who contributed sort of north of 50 papers to the conference are industry entities, right? So Google's number 1, they had 88 papers. Microsoft had 60, SenseTime had 56, Huawei had 44. And so, you see these names of massive, billion-dollar corporations that now have begun to have really significant impact on the direction and shape of these fields. And not to say rightly or wrongly, but just merely to look at that trend. And so I'd love to have people talk about their experience with how industry is affecting the themes in robotics, and then their hopes, dreams, or fears for the future of what that would mean for a similar transformation to happen to us.
So I think can I go this first this time, Chris? I think the worry that a lot of us have in academia is that we're just cheap labor for industry. That we are really just we are supposed to do the publishing system and the merit review system for funding incentivizes sort of producing results, incremental things that we have a good idea are going to work, but not the moonshots that that could pan out in the distant future. In that regard, we're sort of we're doing the same things that are happening in industry, or we're funded to do that. But we don't have the resources nor the mindset really to compete with that type of thinking. And so I think we're the incremental nature, the incrementality of the research enterprise right now, I think is a big concern. And I think and we can also see it with respect to producing people for industry. A lot of our faculty go off on leaves and sabbaticals. We do not have enough faculty to meet student demand, that will meet the workforce demand that's out there. And so so there's I would say to my industry colleagues, I hope that you can help us be better stewards, and it starts by investing in some of the faculty and not eating your seed corn, as they might say.
So as the one industry person here on this panel, so I feel some pressure for this question. Yeah. So first and foremost, you're not just a repository of bodies for industry. So there's a hugely different role academia plays, and in some sense, I have a bit of insight because I came in from a postdoc straight into industry, and I've been in industry now for 4 years. So why certain fields are seeing massive amount of progress is so obvious to me in my last 4 years, because industry, your research is not something you participate in alone. You're living in an ecosystem of incredible engineering. So you have incredible software engineering to support you. And if you're doing something in robotics, for instance, you're working with the latest, greatest in perception, the latest, greatest in planning, in control, and you leverage all that for your little tiny research problem. So you might be researching a very specific topic, but you're leveraging on the latest, greatest of everything out there. And that makes a huge difference in certain kinds of fields. Now, one of the things Toyota Research has been trying is we do have a lot of active academic collaborations. I'm working with the University of Michigan too, along with several other universities in the US, is that when we do partnerships with universities, we're trying to contribute back some tech. Like you have a lab where, let's say you're training a robot to do some task. Don't waste your time doing 60 post-tracking of objects. I'll give you that piece of tech. It's just, I don't know, a few thousand lines of code for me. It's something which I can share with you, and you can then ask your research question in a much more structured manner. So the only real difference, as far as I'm concerned, between academia and industry, apart from the fact that the ecosystem of tools, is that in academia, you have a longer lead time to explore an idea for what it is. In industry, you do tend to have a shorter fuse. You have an expectation that this free-ended exploration may not yield an outcome, and you're looking for a quantified number saying, my robot has improved its behavior by so inside 6 months. And I would love to help my academic collaborators as much as possible with any kind of tech which will facilitate your research.
To just push on that, to be a little provocative, one could argue that the fundamental divide, though, is that industry exists to make returns for their shareholders and to generate profit, and academia, in theory, increasingly less so every year, exists to generate knowledge, and that is those are the underlying motivations. And then I think, to your point, we see lots of people working within both of those systems doing neither or both of those goals, or none of the above. But it just raises these interesting questions, and I think, anyways, I want to make sure that we, keep it provocative. So, if anyone has a counterpoint to that, we'd love to hear.
I don't think academics necessarily have to focus on producing knowledge, although that's a good goal as well. But we can also focus on benefiting society, which is maybe slightly different.
Sure.
And like as far as industry was probably profit oriented. So, we have a luxury of being able to have completely different motives. Like, I don't want a self-driving car like Google's making. I want a self-driving car that loves me. Then I'll feel safe.
But I think we have to really think about what profit means. I'm lucky that I get to collaborate with industry too. And I see those differences that everybody is talking about, where they have full-time staff working on things and we're working with students typically. So that's why that timeline is a lot slower. So kind of have to realize why. But the motivation for profit really can be different. So profit for a company could be good PR. It could be visibility in a product, maybe a product that's just gaining steam, or it could be profit in terms of selling cars. So I think as researchers, I always feel it is our role to figure out, academic researchers, to figure out how to make that collaboration fit so we get what we need: publications, student support, advancing research, basic research, and they get what they really need, and that's what drives the industry. And that's what makes the collaboration really great, because we get to use their amazing resources and we bring something valuable to the table, including students that get trained in the process too. So maybe it's not as controversial as you want, Matt, but.
Well, it's an excellent point. Maybe I'll throw this to Edward. In thinking about sort of the absence of the state or the government in what this role would have been 20 years ago, where primarily our academic programs were funded by state institutions, and we see this big shift. I don't know. I'd love to hear if you have any thoughts on the trends here in the U.S., where I am, versus Europe, versus Asia, or any thoughts about sort of how the law or the sort of larger arc of what we're seeing in terms of changes at the and the way that state or whatever federal organizations are organizing in the way they think about funding research and doing programs.
I think that also academics also serve as a sort of filter also with the interest of the industry. Sometimes I see like conferences about privacy funded sometimes by Facebook, where there are panels about the future regulation of privacy, which is a bit strange because it's really not that much what they are doing. So sometimes academics also have like a very important role, that although we might not have that much funds from in order to support our research, we also play a crucial role in order to stop the industry from pushing too much their agenda towards policy making and other things. And I'm serving now at the European Commission. We're revising the General the General Product Safety Directive. And you see the industry really pushing so much for, oh no, but this is okay, like we don't really need to change this, because any slightly modification into the regulation, it would cause a lot of problems to them. And it's not that they do not want to comply, they sometimes they really do not want to have an extra burden in order to make a product safer. So I think that academia has a really important role in saying, well, yeah, I might need some money, but I don't want to sell my soul towards the interest of the industry. Of course, I'm not saying that all the industry is evil. I'm not saying that, but it is important to have this impartial role also into really understanding what are the needs of the society and how the industry are meeting those needs.
Maybe we can use this to segue into sort of it's kind of going to bridge between a couple different questions, but one of the things that I think this industry and sort of academia divide has started to highlight is thinking about the distribution of resources on a global scale. So, you know, we're, I think, really lucky in robotics and I think other fields in sort of this technical realm that we really do have very international conferences, right? Like that, you know, the community of people that participate in this is much broader than, say, fields that tend to be much more nationally focused, like even education, other things that come out of academia, where your conferences tend to be less international, both in institutions that are represented, but also the people and where they come from when they get into these fields. But I do think that there's this interesting phenomenon that's starting to arise where we do think, you know, as we get a more globalized society, there is not a uniform distribution of resources across these places. And one of the things that I think, again, to look to computer vision as a highlight is that we see that sort of this unequal distribution of resources and also like has begun to concentrate some of where that resource is happening and what's going on. And so I would love for people to talk about how they think about the international community of roboticists. What do we believe the future of that is going to look like? And how do we sort of try to balance what is inherently, I think, a very expensive field to participate in many ways, right? If you think relative to other disciplines, the resources required to do robotics, which was highlighted by industry, means that perhaps access and the ability to contribute to the state-of-the-art conferences is going to be limited. And I think that's an important thing to think about moving forward if we do want to figure out how we're going to be a global discipline as opposed to one concentrated in primarily wealthy countries.
So this time I can jump in first. So one of the first things I noticed this year with a lot of the top conferences going online is that there's a lot more participation from countries and communities which don't necessarily participate in the quote-unquote top-notch robotics conferences. And for instance, in ICRA, you had people questioning keynote addresses and people giving questions from countries which you have never really seen participate in a reasonable number in ICRA or IROS or these kind of conferences. So that's a big change. And the other side, one of the key answers, I think, to what you're saying is, so knowledge is starting to get democratized. We now have Udacity. You have so many other resources to start learning about robotics wherever you are in the world. But access to technology is hard. But this is where two things can really start to play a role. Number one, simulation. So start having democratized access to simulation resources where someone sitting anywhere can have the same quality of information if they're trying out an algorithm as I am sitting in my office. And number two, open source. So the more industry funds and supports open source projects, the more it leads to much better development all around in robotics. And you then fundamentally understand that it's not just the 10 people I have sitting in this office who are going to contribute. It's this whole body of knowledge which is going to improve on the whole.
Let me also add to that before we move on, that even in your wealthier countries, there is disparities, right? I think if you look at the United States, for instance, the United States isn't just one big country. There are oftentimes two Americas, right? There's the America that we might experience in Ann Arbor or coastal cities like Boston or San Francisco. It's very different than where my family comes from in Southwest Louisiana, Southeast Texas, right? Which if you go there can feel like a different country in some places. In those cases, it's more than just it's not just an intellectual exercise to say we need to help train up people in the way that we've typically trained up people, but it is addressing these cultural issues. Our entire world right now is changed because of what's happened with George Floyd and a number of other very unfortunate incidents that reflect the systemic problems that we have, and it's because there is still an intergenerational foundation, systemic problems that we have to address before we can get to the point in various places where we can get to people being able to contribute open source and using simulations. That systemic issue still is a big big barrier.
Let's stay on this for a moment, and I think talk through, I guess, in broadening the question, what does it mean to have access to, or how do we think about democratization on this axis? And there's a question from the audience that I think we can also try to rope in here. But, I think a point Chad's bringing up, which is important, I'd love to hear other people comment on, is that if within the United States, but also within other countries, how do we think about what it would mean to democratize access to not just robotics more largely, but all of the academic, and industry pieces of this that would enable people to contribute to our community in a way that would be meaningful and that would allow them to feel like they're participating. Maybe I'll throw this to Lydia, and you can talk about sort of what in RAS people are thinking about in terms of access along lines of gender, but I'd love to hear everybody broadly kind of speculate on A, what we're doing now, but B, what we see the biggest headwinds are.
Yeah. So they're not really thinking about democratizing the data. I think there's a lot more conversation at RSS here about democratizing data sets, and I think that's good conversation. It's really helpful so that more participants can be involved in the research. I think RAS's perspective, and this is kind of my own personal opinion of what's been going on, is to really focus on getting involvement from a lot of different countries, a lot of different populations, and trying to getting them involved in the conferences as well. So they were noticing things like the online conferences really bringing in a diverse audience and allowing them access to the research. I know that's something, and that's something that they've tried to do over the years with funding to fund scholarships from underserved populations. But it's a very expensive proposition, especially when you're flying somebody from, whatever country that's underserved. So I do think that's a really good conversation to continue having, and we're not looking at the data. We're not doing a great job at it as a community. It's trying to make sure all those underserved populations are being involved. We are doing a good job of trying to enforce diversity across continents, like across groups. And so we've always, that's been a priority of an entire robotics community for the last like 10 years or so, to just make sure that whenever we organize something, we don't just have the United States running it. It's multiple groups from multiple countries running it. So I think that's been really great, but yeah, I think we do need to do more. And I don't think there's any good or easy solutions. And I think big things like making sure the research is available, making sure that conferences, technical papers are available. I mean, those are expensive. The publications, a lot of them don't necessarily even have access to like the IEEE digital library. So if they are able to actually even just attend the conference and get a full copy of the proceedings, that's really helpful. Just to answer the question, because this is a little bit off, they're actually asking about like populism and subject matter. So like how, if we release the data now, or is everybody going to try to focus on one particular problem? And there was a debate, a really nice debate in the machine learning for task and motion planning workshop earlier in RSS. And it was, the answer is historically, it's, yes, that happens. So you release benchmarks or data sets, and then everybody starts working off of those, and the research kind of goes in one direction. But it's really about making sure that we keep a mindset where that can happen in advanced research in one direction, but we also keep our mind open and see what else there is, so that we don't just focus on one target as a group, as a community.
So I think with democratization of AI and robotics, I think we actually maybe need to be a little careful when we frame this in terms of democratization of the technology. It makes it sort of seem like the challenges of maybe why we are seeing some groups of people dominating the conversation are because the technology has too high of a barrier to entry, which is not necessarily the case. And in fact, I think already the ease of using some of this technology is already a little too low. Maybe not so much in robotics, but as in computer vision. But I know, so like I teach computer vision, and every year for the final projects, we have I have a number of students who propose, oh, I want to do face recognition, yada, yada. And I have to talk to them and say, well, maybe not. Have you thought about these implications, right? And in general, I think we need to do a lot more within our education system in terms of how we're thinking about engineering education to make sure that our education isn't already giving people just enough knowledge that they can be dangerous with it, right? And so I think we want to be careful about necessarily just making it easier to get into using this technology that's potentially dangerous, and instead think about, well, what are the underlying systemic, social, political issues that are causing these disparities in the first place, and what can we do sort of outside of our role of just doing robotics research in order to help address those underlying issues instead.
But can I riff on that point real quick and just say,
Please.
what we've seen is a sort of siloing of the academy. Many students have come into engineering at the cost of, you know, the social sciences, the humanities, and I think it gets to your point, Tom. But I would also say with that you know, there's areas where the other areas of the academy can help us, and that is, how do you socialize these ideas? How do you start to build an identity amongst people who, you know, I won't break it down by geography, but I'll break it down by, let's say, socioeconomic spectrum, or you know, what your parents and your grandparents knew, right? And you know, there's a way to socialize that, because I'm fortunate that my parents had, you know, they both had, you know, have higher education. But if I look at the people I went to high school with in Louisiana, I don't think they would, you know, I don't think you had a lot of people that would understand that being a roboticist is a possibility for them. If you were to ask me when I was 16, and David Duke was running for the Senate, you know, whether I would be in this position now, it was hard for me to envision and dream. We have to inspire and then create a pathway. We think about it all the way from early education to your continued participation in the workforce. Like, that's the kind of engagement that we have to think about longitudinally.
Yeah, I was going to say, oh, go ahead.
No, please.
I was going to say, I completely agree with Chad that, you know, looking back on my life, I mean, my grandparents had a third grade education. Luckily enough, my parents are college educated, and my siblings are as well. And now I'm getting a PhD. Even in 2012, when I was entering college, I was just getting familiar with the idea of getting a PhD at the very basic level. And part of that is because I didn't have the exposure of what that looked like. Nobody told me what a PhD was, and I also didn't know that the resources were out there to find out what it was. So having that exposure first, and then the support that comes with it, having mentors, having people that are pursuing that PhD, or people that are pursuing your dream, or have achieved it, to kind of reach back and understand, you know, here are some of the problems that you're going to run into. Here are some of the concepts that you should probably recognize outside of the technical difficulty and the politics that go with being in academia. And in my personal situation, being a Black man in academia, in engineering, in STEM, and understanding, you know, what kind of ramifications and what kind of challenges you're going to come up against. I think understanding that, you know, especially with the incidents involving George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, like, we really have a spotlight on the injustices and social and systemic issues that we have, not only in our society, but definitely in academia. And that these students it's now seen that these students are going through some of these issues and making it even more difficult. And it kind of speaks to, maybe we'll talk about this a little bit later, but it speaks to the idea of, you know, retention, and the idea of, you know, progressing forward in, you know, inside of academia and inside professorship and so on and so forth. But I completely agree that, like, the exposure is necessary, the support is necessary, not just from, you know, not just students that are normally within these spaces, but the underrepresented minorities, the students that, you know, don't see this type of stuff on a regular basis, if that makes sense. But yeah, I completely agree with Chad.
I think
sorry, go.
one approach to research is just being problem focused, so solving problems. We can think of Elon Musk, you know, trying to automate the Tesla factory, and he failed. Well, that is wonderful from our point of view, because a lot of problems were identified, shortcomings, open problems in our field were identified in that process, and we can say, well, let's solve these problems. But my first couple of years as an assistant professor, all I did was play with Lego robots. And the Lego robots are wonderful because every problem that exists in a robot is in the Lego robot, and it's magnified, so you can work on it kind of on a macroscopic scale almost. So I think that low-cost robotics platforms can actually be amazing vehicles for doing research, because you can tackle these problems in a rather kind of obvious way, whereas with the expensive robots, the problems almost kind of disappear, and you don't realize you should be working on them.
No, I just wanted to say that I think that we do have a very important role as researchers, no matter whether you are in academia or in industry, to really make a difference every single time. And I think that that was a really good point about Black Lives Matter and inclusivity and diversity. Every time, every action you do, you need to think it twice. Who am I benefiting? Who am I challenging? Like, is this going to be open? If it is open, like, it is just not a matter of oh, no, you know what? Like, I'm going to put everything on ResearchGate and it is open. It's not that. Like, there's a lot of different target audiences. Like, how are you reaching people? Like, how are you reaching these neighbors or classmates that Chad was talking about? How do you, when I was at Carnegie Mellon, a lot of teachers would say, like, how do you explain this to grandma, right? And actually that is really important, how to make not only democratizing resources, but also making sure that the target audiences that we are relating to, they really understand what's the value of what you're doing, also what are the shortcomings, and also try to anticipate a little bit, like what are the risks and how we can mitigate them and I think that we do have also a role into this, and that we cannot get tired of putting effort in everything that we do to make this much more available to everyone, actually.
Relate that back to a point that I think both Tom and Chad were making. I think there's a thinking about how other disciplines can inform the way that we think about the ethics, the legal ramifications, the justifications, but most importantly, like, why are we doing any of the robotics that we're doing? Why do neural nets? Why do X? Why do Y? Why do Z? There's what Chris was highlighting, there's a problem solving piece of this, which is simply that there are problems that need to be solved, and that there's a whole host of them. And so we can undertake trying to solve them with a variety of tools we have. But I mean, I think one of the nice things that we're circling around on this panel is, well, what are the problems that we should be solving? What communities do those problems matter to? Like, to whom do those problems matter? And then if we do solve them, or we are attempting to solve them, or we solve them in a way that is equitable, or we solve them in a way that benefits the world more largely. And I think that is one of the reasons that I'm still excited about robotics, is that, to a point that several people have made, it's still a young enough field that those questions, and particularly given it being an applied discipline, those questions are still open for debate. And whoever we are training now as the next generation of people to take over this, those are the people that are going to have to answer what that means for the next 20 or 30 years of the field. And I think we're at a unique inflection point, and maybe we can kind of try to dive into this as we kind of move. It's sort of all around this theme of resources, democratization, but that, if there's this consolidation of resources, so I think one of the questions that was sort of brought up or danced around here is, you think about the Google, Amazons, and Facebooks of the world that have taken over machine learning and computer vision in many ways, in terms of the resources they're able to bring. Okay, that's one model, right? And that is one model for how our field could go. And then the question would be, okay, if it's not going to be that, what is the way that we would have the resources to do this democratization, have the ability to provide, some of the engineering effort or the data sets or whatever to facilitate this kind of work, but without having this incredible narrowing of focus onto a set of problems that the most resourced companies dictate. And then the question is, are those problems that those companies are solving, are those the most important ones for society, or are those simply the ones that they have chosen to solve? So that's a nebulous one. I don't know if anybody wants to jump in on it. But.
As usual, I'm always happy to put that on.
Excellent, Chad.
To get to you know, to me, the main thing that why we care about robots is so we can have an automated labor force. And that is the big question across the academy of what does our labor force look like? You know, I think as a Black man in robotics, I'm always asking myself, is AI and what we do in robotics, is that going to be the equivalent of the cotton gin? And in terms of the rise of the transatlantic slave trade, there's always an economic incentive for this. And so this motivates why academia is so important. It's not just about the technical ideas that appear in the paper, but it's about getting insights from all over that help you inform what this technology is going to look like. You know, the kind of discussions that you hoped, like, you know, like post atomic bomb Oppenheimer had with pre-atomic bomb Oppenheimer, right? Those are kind of discussions we know we should be having. I think I am fortunate to be at a place at the University of Michigan where I don't just have people from all over the country and that type of diversity, but we have people from all over the world, right? As somebody who grew up in America, I have no idea what it's like to grow up in other areas, and they challenge me and I challenge them back, and that makes our products that much better because there are real implications of the work that we do. And I also have to say I'm glad that I'm just going to be really honest about it. That crazy thing that ICE was doing in our country. I'm glad that's gone. I just want to say that, emphasize that, and underline that. So I'll stop.
So it's a very interesting question which was raised about companies now, again, as a company representative, companies now shifting from thinking only of problems to start thinking about what it truly means for society. So on Toyota's side, our big guiding star for robotics is trying to build robots which can truly facilitate aging in place. So build robots which can achieve through elderly care, give them quality of life as they start to lose their facilities and so on. And in this COVID crisis, it's all the more important to understand how much older people are struggling. In a way, it also connects to what Chad was saying, because if you examine the statistics, most of the people doing domestic care for older adults tend to be either immigrant populations, people who are from economically weaker sections, and it's pretty hard work. It's incredibly hard, and sometimes it's very painful and demeaning work because it's not work which benefits our society on the whole. And trying to find a solution through technology for this is one possibility. But on the bigger scale, it's really recognizing that whatever we are building is meant to benefit society. Now, somebody had raised the point, companies exist for profit. But I would argue, at least from a bigger company's perspective, it depends on your time horizon you're talking about. If it's a company which is dependent on your revenue for 2 years, yes. But if it's a company which looks at a much longer time scale, you understand that you live in this world, and when people are happy and when everybody is happy, then you can also be happy. And so your aim is to directly benefit society. So pick your aspect of society and try to help that part of society.
We have a question here from the audience. I just want to make sure we have two actually, one from Hadass I can start with, and we can I'll throw both of them out there just so that they're in the ether. The first was, how do we empower less traditional research questions with the kind of goal of allowing less represented communities to have their voices heard in terms of shaping the conversation? And oh man, we're getting so many questions. And then the second one I'll throw out there, which I think is maybe the first one's more nebulous, so we can do that and kind of riff on it more. The first one I think is this other one's going to be maybe a quicker answer. It's just that the online conferences, the asynchronous nature and the online conferences have changed the ability for people to access a lot of this information and to participate. And the question is, should we keep that, let that people riff on either that idea or what the formatting of the way that we have these international meetings and how that would lead to hopefully thinking about representation in communities?
I can try to take a shot at both of them at the same time.
Excellent.
I think it's great that we are opening up these conferences and people are getting more involved, but it's only the first step in the process. The next step is they have to do research, and it has to be successful, and they want to be published at the conference next time. And then once they start publishing, we've got to get them to the table, and they've got to help organize and do. And we're not, if we look at Hadass and I are actually running a study over RAS, and we're not inviting them to the table. Like, these groups are not, even if we're opening up the first step, opening up the conferences, getting them into the technological, excitement of RSS, they are not getting past that. They're not necessarily going to get past the next step, like getting a paper accepted. So there needs to be more effort put into that entire process to get them to be full participants in the community. So everybody, I just emphasize like getting everybody to the table and at every step. So it's not even happening necessarily at the organizational level as well. So there's not good representation in the robotics conferences there either. So we have to really think about that at every step of the process. Are we getting good representation? And if not, why? And what can we do to help those communities publish or do other things?
That's a great point. I think the thing that we're missing, even though we're getting more people to come, the gold standard of this, right, is that they are getting published work, because that is the metric by which many people are being assessed. And I think that's a great point. While we're increasing representation on other axes, and Chad was making this point earlier in terms of filters and pipelines, and like, if you think about the conference as a mechanism for whatever pipeline is, right, it's knowing about it, participating in it, asking questions, but at some point it has to be publishing in it, and then publishing it at enough volume so that then you are an organizer and you are running these things in the future. And I think that is, it's clear we have a long way to go on that front. So I'm glad you made that point, Lydia, that we're still really early days on that. More questions are coming in. Oh man, sorry. Someone else wanted to say anything on that while I try to parse all these questions.
I will say I answered one in type.
Excellent. Okay.
Typing answers too, but
asynchrony has its downsides.
Well, you have to note there's the open and then there's secret, and both of those have questions that can be addressed. But
okay.
But I think I also wanted to say I posted a link to Moshe Varde's great article in Communications ACM saying it's about publish and perish, which is that physical conferences mean that we have to attend. The effect on the climate from all the travel. As somebody I'm platinum on Delta, right? I look at that with sort of mixed emotions, because that does emit a lot of there are a lot of emissions that go on with that. But there's also, Zoom is great, but there's no replacement for talking with people in person. And so I think that is a challenge to our academic enterprise. Maybe we have more archive style models of conferences. I'm not sure, but I think it's something that should be an active discussion in our community.
And I think that so with COVID, it is causing all these discussions about what is the role of conferences. Even just like with virtual conferences, how do you run a virtual conference for like a small 100-person conference versus a virtual conference for this like large multi-thousand-person conference? But I think the way that maybe this is going to provide some new opportunities for re-envisioning how we are running these conferences that can help promote some of these other ideas we've been talking about. So I think one of the challenges with running some of these like enormous conferences is that it becomes very difficult to maybe carefully select which papers you are including in order to promote a diversity of topics. One of the things I really like about the HRI conference is it's still pretty small, and the way it's organized is they have several tracks. So they have a studies track, they have a technical advances track, they have a theories and methods track. This year we had a reproducibility track, and that's a way for the conference to ensure that there are lots of different types of papers from different communities that are all being presented at the conference. And I think that's maybe more challenging to do when you're dealing with thousands of papers rather than like 50 papers. And so maybe in the future we'll see maybe more of an emphasis, I'm hoping, on sort of smaller and maybe also more regional conferences where it's just much more feasible to be very careful and intentional about promoting a diversity of topics and viewpoints than what is possible at a giant conference like ICRA or IROS.
Sorry, go ahead, please.
Sorry, quickly. These were excellent points. Just wanted to add, we have also so easily fallen into this trap with these big conferences of thinking of this 6-page paper mindset, that I need to have a research which is big enough that it has to land in this conference, which typically involves some sim results, some real results, a couple of analytical things, and have this fancy video with which it's accompanied. But quite often kernels of ideas need not be that big. So I think we need to respect and accept ideas which tend to be smaller. So poster sessions are one way, but that do involve its own difficulties, like getting people to come somewhere. And these are students from who may not have the resources, or students from communities or from nations which may not have the resources to fly somewhere. Now, another little aspect I observed in the conferences this year was people reorganizing in their own little sub-communities, which are not what the traditional conference sessions are about. Now, traditional sessions were driven by the conference organizers. And for instance, in ICRA, I saw over Slack, people reorganizing on completely different Slack channels, which were totally different from the main threads. And that was so unique and interesting because there's two sides. One, am I going to learn something new? And two, I have this problem, which is really, really annoying. Perhaps somebody out there has the same problem. Let's just meet on a new Slack channel and talk about it. And that's been amazing to see how people come together, because all you want is finally to get ideas from each other.
I think also smaller venues might also provide room for these underrepresented communities to feel more at ease in a more comfortable setting. Sometimes I felt that in smaller events, I got to meet people and get the conversation flowing in a much more profound and deeper way, which allowed also to open up many different questions that wouldn't be that easy to be presented in a traditional conference format. So I would also promote these smaller events where there are these conversations where you could have a walk. Of course, if it is online, that you might lose it, no, but you could have a walk with someone, and then you could just like open up a little bit. I think that is also very, very helpful. Also to build, it's a relationship building, no, beyond what it's a mere network or a mere connection. It's just a relationship building. I think it's very important, especially if we want to be inclusive.
Can I add I saw a question. This is from David about the top reviewer award and incentivizing people to provide quality reviews. And I would just like to say one of the biggest problems for diversity, but also incrementalism in our field, is the peer review process, is the merit review process. And also in the classroom, what we think of as teacher evaluations is actually popularity surveys, customer service satisfaction surveys. I think the way we think about evaluating work is not necessarily, what we consider to be the gold standards are not necessarily the gold standards. I think we have major concerns about collusion and gaming of the review processes right now. That's a big concern, I believe, across many conferences and journals. But it also gets to what we're doing is a placeholder for actual scientific review. Science isn't about, let me ask three people I know and get their opinion about a paper, and they'll say something about it. Scientific review is actually, let's take a paper, try to re-implement it, try to reproduce, maybe not necessarily replicate, which would be an exact reproduction, an exact recreation, but reproduce it and understanding. So because science at the end of the day is about doing it for yourself and having your own understanding of a piece of work. And so we should just understand our peer review processes are placeholders for actual science.
That couldn't agree more. Look, what I'd love to do is, we only have about 7 minutes left, but I'd love to get a minute from sort of each of the panelists on how they see robotics moving, changing, being, where it's going to be 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 108 years from now. Pick any point on that timeline, or next semester. It doesn't matter to me. And just what they're excited about, or where they think robotics is going to be, what the future of it's going to be. So Kendall's up the top of my left of my screen, so maybe you go first, Kendall.
Oh man, so I kind of want to. I think I'll be safer if I take the 100-year level. So, robotics, and my passion for robotics was always sparked by science fiction, and we all know, especially at this level, that science fiction may portray an idea of robotics that's not true, and especially not right now. But I mean, I would like to see, you know, the trust level for having robotics included into our community as and interacting with humans to be much higher. You know, like the visions of like the Bicentennial Man and the good part of iRobot and you know, some pieces of like old movie Lost in Space, like that stuff is what kind of got me excited in the first place. And I would love to see that our society interact with robotics at a different level. And hopefully, you know, with AI continuing, you know, to push through, we can have robots that are more intelligent and understanding, you know, the latent cues of humans and intentions, as well as, you know, having those emotions, like Chris was saying, and moving forward from there. So I'm going to take the 100-year jump, and you know, we don't really know what it's going to look like just yet, but hopefully we can get to a better place. And that's on the technological front, and then on the diversity front, I would like to see more participation of, you know, POCs, of underrepresented minorities, of countries that are not normally represented in robotics, to be a part of our community and to you know, continue to contribute very important perspectives as well as answers to some of the questions that we have. So I think that we can make that happen. And I'm hoping that part happens a little bit sooner than 100 years, you know, 10, 20. But yeah, I'd love to see the robotics community and robotics in general jump to those heights in that time frame.
Awesome. I got you to my right, Tom.
Yeah, sure. I guess I will take sort of the opposite perspective, that I feel like the 100-year vision is way too hard for me to think about, and so I'll take like the 10-year vision. So what I would really like to see is this is sort of funny for me because my background is much more on the AI side of things than on the HCI side of things, but I would really like to see maybe things slow down a little technically, and for much more attention to be paid to the social implications and these interaction issues. But specifically, I don't want to see more people who that is their research focus presenting at conferences, but rather I would love to see the field move in a direction where everybody just takes these issues as a key part of their research and is thinking about them when they're writing papers, not just for our research, but also so that translates into the classroom. I teach robot ethics. I love teaching that class, but I don't necessarily think that is really the right way that we ultimately want to be teaching these types of topics. I think that we need to be covering these issues of interaction and ethics and racial justice and all these issues that are important for everybody to be considering in all of our robotics classes, so that students don't come to think of it as just like the thing you take in that one elective senior year, and so that people don't think of it as, oh, well, there's, you know, this person at the conference who does that type of research, but that's what he or she does, and I don't need to work on that. So I'd like to see I think we can get there in 10 years.
All right. I love it. I got Lydia, Chris, and Chad below me. We're running low on time, so maybe give me a couple sentences from each of you of your whole 100-year vision for the future of the world.
Okay, I'll go first. I think it's, I kind of see this ubiquity in robotics in 100 years. It's just going to be in lots of different areas, lots of different fields, even ones that we don't see a lot of applications in right now. We're going to take a lot of the methodologies and the solutions that we're coming up now and apply them to different areas in the long future. Cool.
You know, psychologists have shown that people who interact with robots all day long lose empathy when they go and interact with other people, because the robots are like predictable and do what they want them to do, and they can treat them however they want. But if you train a dog, you actually build empathy. So I think we definitely need robots with feedback that where we can have personalities and emotions and things, where the robot actually reacts to how it gets treated, and then we can actually build empathy when we go and treat each other. After we interact with the robot. And I think diverse groups will be leading this kind of research. Absolutely.
I just want also to add to Tom's point. I think that also we need to see those robots and those AI in the School of Law and in philosophy departments, because sometimes our discussions are not that much grounded in what actually robot capabilities have. So I think that it needs to be both ways. Like I can come to you and explain you like some of the principles and values that we need to ensure in human-robot interaction. But I think that you also need to come to our classes and say, well, these are the advances, like this is what actually robots can do, because otherwise then the European Parliament in 2017 starts like quoting Frankenstein and then Isaac Asimov laws, and they say, well, wait a second, is this science fiction, is this law, where are we going? So I think that it needs to be bi-directional, and I think that with that we will have much more meaningful discussions.
So if I can sneak in a closing word. So I'm a techno-optimist. I strongly believe in a 100-year time frame, technology can help society, but this cannot happen in isolation to all the systematic issues, especially the issues that Chad and others were mentioning. Society needs to first look at itself and try to fix itself in the next 10, 20 years. There's so many fundamental things. And in terms of research, D&I is a fundamental aspect of trying to achieve a technology which can benefit all of us. But I truly see robots helping us, but it cannot help us change ourselves. We first have to change ourselves, and only then robots can come in and make our lives better as we get older, as we get more infirm, etc.
Chad, last word. Hit us with it.
I hope that in 100 years from now, what we have is in our research labs, our classrooms, and our development teams that population reflects the global population and provides equal opportunity. I would like that our field of robotics remembers, just thinks about what our field would look like if we didn't have Ada Lovelace, who helped create the general purpose computer. What would our field look like if we didn't have Alan Turing, a white gay man who changed our field and provided a lot of foundations? When I was a young graduate student, people would talk about Rao Blackwell's particle filtering. I didn't even realize that David Blackwell was a black mathematician. And so I think if we understand all of those contributions, we have everybody bringing something to the table, that will lead to good outcomes for our field.
Look, I want to thank everybody on the panel. I want to thank everybody in the audience. This has been great. The organizers, particularly, thank you so much. Martin, Tori, it's been great. Really appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with everybody here. And, 100 years from now, we'll all meet back up. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for organizing this.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much. This is awesome.
It was wonderful. Thank you.